Well, this morning we have great examples of those who persist. Whether you're a Seattle Mariners fan or an Astros fan, last night was an example of persistence. For Seattle, they'd been waiting years and years to come to the place where they had a shot. And for Houston, they played and played until they did. Persistence furthers, as the Tao says, and so does the gospel. In today's gospel reading from Luke, we're meeting Jesus and his disciples at a time when Jesus has been laying it on heavy. Being a friend of his, being a follower, is serious business. You have to take up your cross. You have to leave your family. You have to shun the ways of those around you and be willing to go to the end. His disciples are worn out at the prospect of having to do these things. And Jesus, ever a reader of people's hearts and minds and bodies, tells them a parable in order to illustrate that they are to pray always and not to lose heart. Pray always and don't lose heart. So he tells this story of this widow, and you will remember that widows are the people who are most marginal in the society. They're some of the least attended to people in Jesus' world. They're women, for one thing, in a very patriarchal society. They're a burden on the socioeconomic structure, and so they have nobody to take care of them, no man to be providing for them. They are often unseen. This is a particular widow, though, because she has had something that's happened to her that was a profound injustice. And she has the audacity to engage in a legal system that she knows is rigged against her. Not only is she a nobody in a marginalized way, she knows that the legal system does not care about her and her rights. Further, she knows that the judge that she's going before cares neither for God or people. For the lawyers in the room, you probably know some of those judges. They have reputations that you can go and prepare your case as well as you can, but at the end of the day, those judges and justices may have blinders on and an opinion, and they may have not had their coffee that day. Justice can be fickle. If you're a person of color or a drug offender, you're particularly vulnerable as you come before the judge about whether your needs are going to be heard. And God forbid that you're facing eviction, because in our county, too often, we're going before judges on our own without legal representation. This widow has chutzpah as she's coming to this court, to this judge. I wonder why she does it. I was thinking about the power of persistence and of the ways that our awareness of injustice propels us forward. Justice is not one of those values that you're born with. You come into your sense of justice and injustice when you're about 7 years old. It's not fair, you can say on the playground to your parents. Teenagers are very attuned, and middle schoolers especially as well, to the sense of whether adults are being just or not, whether they're being hypocritical or not. And they'll call it out when they see it, because they see it and they know it. We also have awareness of when things seem unjust and the need to continue to raise the issues, whether it's as women being paid unequally, whether it's being a person of color in a system that is not set up to listen to our voices, whether it's being a person who has mental health challenges, going to physicians who aren't trained to be listening for the whole person. We can be feeling injustice in many different ways. This woman is feeling that she has been the victim, but she doesn't act like a victim. She chooses to persist in a commitment and faith that justice is possible and that she will get some. The virtue of persistence is underestimated, I think, in our culture. We tend to want things very quickly to be resolved. And in our internet kind of way of living digitally, we get immediate responses. And so the cultivation of capacity to persist can elude us unless we are deliberate. Jesus knows this as he says to his disciples, you need to learn how to pray and persist in prayer in order to have faith. We do know this power of persistence. For some of us, we may experience it in school when we're with a teacher or having to engage a subject that eludes us. For me, it was high school physics. I had a horrible teacher, Miss Foster. She was awful, but I also could not get physics. I kind of know entropy now as a concept, but that's as deep as my knowledge of physics goes. I persisted and got at least a B. We also know persistence when we're trying to learn a musical instrument. If you pick up a guitar or a flute, or God forbid, a violin or a ukulele, and or trumpet, right? You suck when you start, right? You cannot go about whether this is going to be a fit for you at the beginning. It's only if you persist and practice that you get any kind of semblance of music. Persistence happens for us in love relationships too. Sometimes the object of our affection doesn't reciprocate, but persistence can further as we woo, and wooing is half the fun, even though when you're the one having to persist and not be the pursued, it can also be a strain. As we age, persistence also becomes a real challenge that we have to cultivate. When our bodies are starting to break down, and we notice things in them that our mind is not catching up with our bodies, that is deeply frustrating. We've got to persist in practices and change that we would as soon give up as we could. I think about diabetes as a diagnosis, when you have to change the fact that you can't eat ice cream as often as you would like, and yet have to persist in attention. We also have to persist in our relationships as they evolve. I think about those of us who are tending to elders who are needing our attention and care. Those changes in power as we go from being the child to being the caretaker, and if you're the one who's having to receive care, how hard it is to persist in a spirit of grace when what you want to do is wring your children's necks or your caregiver bite their head off. Persistence is difficult and necessary. Jesus recognizes that if there's going to be faith, his friends are going to have to pray, and they're going to have to pray with persistence for justice. Because justice is never given on its own. Justice is always worked for. We know this. If we think about the history of this country as we deal and reflect on our history with the Indigenous and First Nations people, we know how we have ignored their claims, and that we persist in intransigence on those issues sometimes. But the presence of First Nations people reflects the fact that they persist and persist in challenging our awareness of injustice, their claims against us. For people of African descent who have come from enslaved people, we also know the challenge of people in power historically wanting to retain that power and privilege. The other important component that we've learned from African Americans in our country is that it's not only a matter of persistence, it's inviting us to think not only of intent, but of impact. Persistence is about reminding us it's not enough just to wish it weren't so, or to say something off the cuff. Justice involves being mindful of impact. This is uncomfortable for those of us who don't experience that as injustice, who think our intentions are pure. Prayer and persistence maintain faith that enables justice. Now, this judge, going back to the parable, does not change out of the goodness of his own heart. This guy is a schmo, and he likes his power, and he does not want to be challenged. The thing about persistence is that it goes on and on and on, and it wears people out. You think about water torture, right? On the forehead. That persistent widow, who, by the way, this parable was called the parable of the unjust judge forever, and it was only recently that we started reflecting on the power of persistence. That judge wants her to go away and shut the hell up. That's the origin of hush puppies, by the way, in the Civil War. Those little cornbread round things. You threw them to the dogs to get them to shut up. Hush puppy. I think this parable is like that. It's about hush puppy. That's what he thinks it's about, right? He thinks he's shutting her up. What she knows is that justice is being done, that her persistence is creating space for justice. We know the power of that too. Rose was alluding to that in her talk this morning. Those of us in the LGBTQ community know that you don't get rights just because it comes out of the goodness of somebody's heart. It was persistent presence. It was persistent advocacy. It was persistent relationship with family members and faith communities over many years that have led us to this place where there can be marriage. And we know how tenuous that justice is. For those of us who are coming from racial minorities, we know that nothing is given. It's only arrived at through persistence and insistence. And for women, we know that patriarchy is an inherently powerful structure. It is only through women's insistence on presence and equality that that needle moves at all. Jesus knows that we get weary and that we will be tempted to think that justice and change rests on our shoulders and on the good graces of judges like the one in this parable today. But he reminds us that faith on the earth is contingent upon our trust that God cares and is present and is working through us in our persistence. Faith does not mean that we accomplish it all. Faith means that we persist to have impact for change. And so, friends, as we contemplate today our role in going, I want to challenge you to think about where you are going and to pray. Pray deliberately in your going that you may have strength and courage to persist. Because as we persist, justice becomes more real, the impact becomes more tangible, and it's in that way that hope and covenant is born. We don't want our children's teeth to be set on edge because we ate sour grapes and refused to persist. Let us have faith, and may God see it upon God's return. Amen.